The baccarat crystal caught the dazzling stage lights, but my focus was on the cloudy white powder dissolving in the champagne. I did not scream. Instead, I smiled and raised a toast to the devoted assistant standing beside my husband. Tonight, the most prestigious award in architecture would not be the only thing presented. I was also delivering a life sentence to the man who just tried to poison me. My name is Blair Monroe. At 38, I am the CEO and lead visionary of Ethelgard Structures, a firm that doesn't just build skyscrapers, but remolds skylines. Tonight was the preamble, the pre-gala reception for the Global Visionary Architect Award here in New York. The air in the grand hall was thick with the scent of lilies and old money, a glittering sea of 200 VIPs, all orbiting the brightest star. Me, and there, orbiting closest, were my two biggest liabilities: my husband, Julian, and my assistant, Kyla. Julian is the perfect corporate spouse, a masterpiece of tailored Armani and effortless charm. He is also the chief financial officer of my company, a title I gave him, and a role he performs with the lethal incompetence of a golden retriever. Beside him was Kyla, 24, hungry, with a smile as sharp as her stilettos. She was ambitious, which I had valued, until now. I was across the room, accepting congratulations, but my focus was a laser. I design buildings to withstand earthquakes. I noticed the smallest tremor. I saw Julian at the bar, his back to the room. He thought he was unobserved. He signaled the bartender for my usual champagne. As the bartender turned, Julian's hand dipped into his jacket pocket. I watched his fingers, those elegant, useless fingers, tremble as he shook a fine white powder into the baccarat flute. There was no panic, no sudden rush of blood. My brain, the same analytical machine that can visualize a 1,000-foot tower from a blank page, simply processed the data. This was not a betrayal of the heart. It was a hostile takeover. It was a poorly executed design. A glance flickered between him and Kyla. It was barely a micro-expression, but it was a blueprint. It held their entire sordid affair, their shared ambition, their conspiracy. They were partners, and I was the project they were set to demolish. I let the last well-wisher kiss my cheek, and then I moved. I glided toward them, my smile serene, my heels silent on the Italian marble. Julian saw me, and his own smile brightened, a sickening, false wattage. Kyla stood beside him, glowing with a proprietary air she had not earned. "Darling," Julian said, his voice smooth. He picked up the poisoned flute, the one he had just prepared, and held it out to me. A drink, for the woman of the hour. I smiled at him. I did not take the glass. Instead, I moved closer, invading his personal space, my eyes fixed on his chest. "Julian, your tie," I murmured, my voice a soft reproof. I reached up, my fingers brushing the silk. He froze, his arm still extended, the glass held aloft like a grotesque offering. My gesture held his attention, and Kyla's. In that moment of shared focus, with his eyes on my face and his body rigid, I performed the switch. My hand, the one not on his tie, moved with the precision of a scalpel. I took the poisoned flute from his outstretched hand, but I didn't take it for myself. I turned, my smile widening, and extended the glass to Kyla. "Kyla," I said, my voice ringing with false magnanimity. "You have worked so tirelessly, all those late nights, all those silent contributions." I pushed the glass firmly into her hand. "You should be the one to have this, a special toast, from Julian and me, to you." She flushed, flattered by the public display. "Oh, Ms. Monroe, I could not." "Nonsense," I insisted, my tone leaving no room for refusal. "Drink up. You have earned this honor." I then reached over and picked up Kyla's original clean glass from the bar. I raised it. To Kyla. Julian stood there, a statue of terror. His face, moments ago so handsome, was now a mask of draining blood. He could not move, he could not speak, he could not yell, "Do not drink that. It is the poison I meant for my wife." His eyes, wide and horrified, locked onto Kyla's mouth as she, beaming with pride, raised the glass and took a deep, appreciative sip. It took exactly 4 minutes for the toxin to bridge the gap between digestion and destruction. Kyla had been beaming, basking in the unearned spotlight of my praise, when the glass slipped from her fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a shatter that cut through the ambient jazz and polite chatter like a gunshot. The silence that followed was absolute. Kyla brought a hand to her throat, her eyes wide and bewildered. She tried to speak, perhaps to apologize for the mess, but all that came out was a wet, strangulated wheeze. Then her legs gave way. She collapsed not with the grace of a fainting heroine, but with the violent, jerky spasms of a puppet whose strings were being cut one by one. Chaos erupted among the 200 VIP guests. Screams punctuated the air as Kyla began to convulse. Foam gathered at the corners of her mouth, white and frothy, contrasting starkly with the crimson lipstick she had applied so carefully in the ladies' room just 20 minutes prior. Julian moved before anyone else. He abandoned all pretense of professional distance. He was on his knees beside her instantly, ruining the knees of his $3,000 suit in the spilled champagne and shards of crystal. He cradled her head, his hands shaking violently. "Kyla, look at me," he screamed, his voice cracking with a desperation that went far beyond the concern of a chief financial officer for a junior assistant. He was practically weeping, wiping the foam from her lips with his bare thumb. I stood over them, a pillar of concern to the onlookers, but an iceberg to those who knew where to look. I feigned shock, covering my mouth with my hand, but my eyes were dry and recording every frame. I watched Julian. I saw the terror in his eyes, but beneath the terror was a dawning, horrific realization. He looked up at me, his gaze darting between my calm face and Kyla's writhing body. He was searching for a sign that I knew, a sign that this was retaliation. But I gave him nothing. I offered him only the blank mask of a worried wife and employer. When the paramedics burst through the double doors, the room parted. They loaded Kyla onto the stretcher, strapping her down as her seizing continued. Julian stood up, frantic, grabbing his jacket. "I am going with her," he announced, taking a step toward the gurney. I stepped into his path. I did not touch him, but my presence was a wall he could not breach. "Julian, stop." "She is dying. Blair, I have to go," he hissed, his voice low so the nearby investors wouldn't hear the panic. "You are the CFO of Ethelgard Structures," I said, my voice clipped and authoritative. "We have the press here. We have the board members. If you run off in an ambulance with a 24-year-old assistant, the rumors will destroy our stock value by morning. You stay here. You manage the crisis. That is your job." He stared at me, trapped between his love for his mistress and the cage of his own lies. He could not argue without admitting the affair. He watched helplessly as the red lights of the ambulance washed over the walls and then faded into the New York night. He was left standing in the wreckage, vibrating with adrenaline and confusion. I could see the gears turning in his head. He was replaying the moment at the bar. Did he mix up the glasses? Did I switch them? Was it just a cosmic accident? He looked at me again, searching for a clue, but I turned away. I signaled the head of security, a large man named Marcus who had been with me since the founding of the firm. A waiter was approaching the spill with a broom and dustpan. "Stop!" I commanded, loud enough for Julian to hear. "Do not touch that." I pointed to the shattered remains of the glass Kyla had dropped. "Marcus, I want this area cordoned off. Collect every shard of that glass and seal it in an evidence bag. The doctors will need to know exactly what toxin she ingested to treat her. This is a medical necessity." Julian's face went from pale to the color of ash. He knew exactly what residue was on those shards. By preserving the glass to save her life, I was simultaneously preserving the fingerprint of his crime. As the staff began to usher the rattled guests toward the exits, apologizing profusely, I allowed myself a moment of internal clarity. The timing was not random. The Global Visionary Architect Award ceremony was next week. If I died tonight, Julian would inherit the controlling stake in the company automatically. He would be the grieving widower accepting my award, the new face of Ethelgard Structures, with his young mistress by his side once a respectable mourning period had passed. He tried to kill me tonight because next week, after the award, my profile would be too high and the scrutiny too intense. He wanted to steal my legacy before the world officially crowned me its queen. The silence in our penthouse that night was heavier than the reinforced concrete I used in my foundations. Julian lay in bed, his breathing ragged and shallow, feigning sleep just as he feigned competence. I waited until the digital clock on the nightstand read 3 a.m. When his rhythm finally settled into the heavy, drug-induced slumber of a man who had taken too many sedatives to quiet his panic, I slipped out from under the duvet. I did not go to the kitchen for water. I went straight to his home office, a room I had designed for him, lined with mahogany he did not appreciate and books he had never read. I sat at his desk and opened his laptop. The screen glowed to life, demanding a password. Julian was a creature of habit and intellectually lazy. I tried his birthday. Incorrect. I tried our anniversary. Incorrect. Then, with a dry, humorless smirk, I typed in Kyla's birthday. The screen unlocked immediately. I bypassed his surface-level files and went straight to the hidden partitions. I needed to understand the desperation that drives a man to murder his wife in a room full of witnesses. It did not take long. The financial records were a slaughterhouse of red ink. Julian had leveraged our joint assets to invest in volatile cryptocurrencies, betting on digital coins that had crashed and burned months ago. The numbers were nauseating. He was not just broke, he was underwater. He owed $5 million to a private lending group, the kind of organization that did not file lawsuits but rather broke femurs. The debt was due next week. I kept digging. I found a folder buried deep in the system directory. It contained a series of encrypted emails with a supplier listed only as V. They discussed a substance called Wraith. The description was clinical and chilling. It was a colorless, odorless neurotoxin derived from rare pufferfish venom. The emails promised that it mimicked a massive cerebral hemorrhage and degraded within 6 hours, leaving no trace for a standard toxicology screen. This was why Julian had looked like he had seen a ghost when I ordered the glass sealed. He knew the clock was ticking on the evidence. Then I found the master plan. It was a document titled Golden Widow. The sheer arrogance of the title made my stomach turn. It was not just a murder plot, it was a business proposal. They had outlined a timeline. Phase 1 was my death, staged as a stress-induced stroke caused by my legendary workaholism. Phase 2 involved Julian stepping in as the grieving interim CEO. Phase 3 was the liquidation of my assets to pay off his debts, followed by a quiet marriage to Kyla a year later. I plugged in my encrypted external hard drive and began the transfer. As the progress bar crawled across the screen, I opened their chat history. This was the only moment my pulse quickened, not out of heartbreak, but out of sheer offense. They had exchanged hundreds of messages mocking me. Kyla called me the Ice Queen in the ATM. Julian complained that I was dry, boring, and married to my blueprints. He wrote that touching me was like hugging a marble column. I read every word. I did not shed a tear. To cry for Julian would be like crying over a broken toaster. He was simply a malfunction that needed to be removed. My pain was cerebral, cold, and sharp. He had insulted my intelligence. He believed he could outsmart the woman who built skyscrapers that could sway in a hurricane without cracking. He thought he could dismantle my life and build a new one on the rubble of my hard work. I watched the transfer hit 100%. I ejected the drive and slipped it into the pocket of my silk robe. I had everything I needed: the financial motive, the weapon procurement, the conspiracy, and the confession of intent. I walked back to the bedroom and looked down at my husband. He twitched in his sleep, perhaps dreaming of the fortune he thought he was about to inherit. He had no idea that the woman lying next to him was no longer his wife. I was now the architect of his ruin. The next morning, the city was gray and weeping with a light drizzle, a fitting backdrop for the demolition of my marriage. I left Julian sleeping, exhausted from his night of panic, and made my way to a private recording studio in Tribeca. It was a property I had designed for a reclusive musician, and I knew the soundproofing was absolute. Silas Vance, my personal attorney for 15 years, was waiting for me. He was a man of few words and sharp suits, the only person I trusted to bury a body, legal or otherwise. Silas laid the documents out on the mixing console. The lighting was dim, but the reality was stark. We reviewed the prenuptial agreement and my current will. As it stood, if I died, Julian would inherit everything: the company, the real estate portfolio, the offshore accounts, and the rights to every design I had ever created. I was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and currently, my death was the only way Julian could access that liquidity to pay off his debts. I was more valuable to him in a coffin than I was in our bed. I looked Silas in the eye and gave the order. We drafted a new will on the spot. I revoked all prior bequests. In the event of my death, whether by natural causes or foul play, every single asset would bypass Julian completely. The entire estate was to be transferred immediately into a charitable trust dedicated to preserving historical architecture. Julian would not receive a single cent. Not the penthouse, not the cars, not even my watch. I signed the document with a steady hand, effectively removing the price tag from my head. My next call was to a private investigation firm that specialized in corporate espionage. I did not need them to follow a cheating spouse. I needed them to build a surveillance state within my own home. I gave them the access codes to the penthouse and the spare keys to Julian's Tesla. By the time Julian woke up and left for the hospital, they would have micro cameras installed in the smoke detectors, the air vents, and even behind the vanity mirror in the bathroom. Audio bugs were planted under the driver's seat of his car. I needed to hear him scream when the walls started closing in. I needed to capture every whispered confession and every frantic phone call. Once the legal and surveillance traps were set, I put on my mask of the concerned employer and went to the hospital. The intensive care unit was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of monitors. Kyla looked small and fragile in the hospital bed, a tangle of tubes and wires keeping her tethered to the world. Her face was pale, stripped of the arrogance that usually defined her. She was still in a coma, her body fighting the war that Julian had started. I found her attending physician, Dr. Evans, reviewing her charts in the hallway. I approached him with furrowed brows, clasping my hands together in a display of anxiety. I asked him about her condition, pressing for details. He looked troubled. He admitted that the toxicology report was showing spikes that were inconsistent with alcohol poisoning or a standard allergic reaction. He mentioned traces of a neurotoxin but was struggling to identify the source. This was my opening. I looked at the doctor with wide, innocent eyes and suggested that perhaps it was a severe case of food poisoning from the catering at the event. I insisted that we had a duty to the public. I told him that I would personally contact the police to open an investigation into the catering company to ensure no other guests were at risk. It was a calculated move. By inviting the police to investigate food poisoning, I was bringing law enforcement into the equation under a pretext that would make Julian feel safe. He would think I was chasing bad shellfish, not a murderer. He would relax, thinking I was clueless, all while I handed the police the magnifying glass they needed to find him. The psychological torture began with a sheet of paper. I printed out a dense medical journal article detailing the specific, agonizing symptoms of neurotoxic poisoning, highlighting the section on respiratory paralysis in neon yellow ink. I left it casually on the marble island in the kitchen, right next to his espresso machine, a place where he could not miss it. From the reflection in the patio doors, I watched him walk in. He picked it up, read the headline, and his hand spasmed violently. He crumpled the paper immediately, shoving it deep into the trash compactor as if it were radioactive. When I walked into the room seconds later, asking innocently if he had seen my research for the new hospital wing I was bidding on, he looked as though he was about to vomit. He lied and said no. I kissed his cheek, noting that his skin was cold, clammy, and smelled distinctively of fear. That evening, over a dinner of roasted lamb that he barely touched, I tightened the screws. I poured myself a glass of red wine and swirled it slowly, mesmerizing him with the dark red liquid. I told him that I felt incredibly lucky. I looked him dead in the eye and said that fate must have intervened that night at the party. I mused aloud that if I had taken just one sip of that champagne, I might be the one in that hospital bed instead of poor Kyla. I watched a single bead of sweat roll down his temple and disappear into his stiff collar. He tried to agree, forcing a smile that looked more like a rictus of pain. He muttered something about how tragedies happen and how we must be grateful for our health. Inside, his mind was fracturing. I could practically hear the gears grinding against each other. He was terrified that Kyla had somehow mixed up the glasses herself in a moment of stupidity, or that a waiter had bumped the table and switched them. He was drowning in paranoia, suspecting everyone and everything. Except for me. To him, I was still the oblivious wife, the cash cow he had failed to slaughter. The pressure from the outside world arrived right on schedule. I had anonymously tipped off his illegal creditors about a fictional asset freeze, prompting them to accelerate their collection timeline. His phone rang during dessert. He looked at the screen and turned the color of ash. He excused himself to the balcony, thinking he was safe from my ears. He did not know about the high-fidelity microphone I had planted in the potted fern. I sat at the dining table, calmly eating chocolate mousse, while I listened to a man with a thick, rough voice threaten to physically dismantle Julian if he did not come up with $5 million by Monday morning. Julian begged. He pleaded for just a few more days. He promised that a massive windfall was coming. When he returned to the table, he looked like a man walking to the gallows. It was time to offer him the rope. I waited until he had finished his third scotch and his hands had stopped shaking enough to hold a glass. I sat down across from him and clasped his hands in mine. I told him I had a surprise. I announced that at the award ceremony this coming Saturday, I was going to publicly unveil a massive merger with a conglomerate called Orion Zenith. I lied smoothly, painting a vivid picture of a deal that would bring an immediate cash injection of $50 million into the company accounts the moment the contracts were signed. I watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. It was instantaneous. The despair vanished, replaced by a sharp, predatory glint. He realized that his problem had a solution. If I signed that merger deal on Saturday, the company would be flush with liquid cash. And if I were to die immediately after the signing, or even during the chaos of the ceremony, he would inherit control of those funds before the banks could lock them down. He could pay off the debt, silence the creditors, and still have millions left over. I had just given him a deadline and a renewed motive. He squeezed my hands back, feigning excitement for my success, telling me how proud he was, but I knew exactly what he was thinking. He was thinking that Saturday night would be the night I finally died. The trap was a masterpiece of corporate fiction. I spent the morning working with my most trusted IT security officer to fabricate a digital ghost. We created a complete, legitimate-looking web portal for a non-existent conglomerate named Orion Zenith. The documents were perfect, printed on heavy bond paper with embossed watermarks. Buried within the legalese of the merger agreement was the honeypot, which was a clause detailing an immediate signing bonus of $10 million, payable to a discretionary holding account for operational integration. I placed the folder on the duvet at the foot of our bed, the red confidential stamp facing up like a beacon. Stuck to the inside cover was a yellow sticky note with the secure login credentials and the access key for the holding account. I left the door slightly ajar and went into the master bathroom. I turned the shower on full blast, letting the steam build, creating a wall of white noise that would mask any sound from the bedroom. I did not bathe. I sat on the closed toilet lid, watching the live feed from the bedroom camera on my waterproof tablet. It took less than 2 minutes. Julian slid into the room like a shadow. He checked the bathroom door, listening for the water. Satisfied that I was occupied, he moved to the bed. On the screen, I watched my husband flip open the folder. He did not read the contract. He did not care about the terms or the future of the company. He went straight for the sticky note. He pulled out his phone and took 3 rapid photographs of the login details. He smoothed the duvet back down, placed the folder exactly where it had been, and slipped out. 10 minutes later, while I was drying my hair, my phone vibrated on the vanity. It was a notification from the dummy server. User admin had logged in. I watched the activity log populate in real time. Julian did not hesitate. He navigated to the beneficiary settings for the $10 million transfer. He deleted the default corporate holding account and entered a new routing number. I recognized it immediately. It was a shell account in the Cayman Islands he had opened years ago. Then, he added a secondary beneficiary, entering the name Kyla Vance. With that single click of the save button, Julian had sealed his fate. He had just committed wire fraud, attempted embezzlement, and conspiracy to defraud a corporation. It was no longer a domestic dispute. It was a federal crime, and I had the server logs to prove it. With Julian's legal coffin nailed shut, I needed to secure the final witness. I drove to the hospital. The air in the private recovery room was stale and smelled of antiseptic. Kyla was awake, propped up on pillows, her skin the color of old parchment. She looked terrified, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting an assassin in every shadow. I sat beside her bed, radiating the warmth of a concerned matriarch. I took her cold, limp hand in mine. She flinched, but I held on. I leaned in close, invading her personal space, bringing my lips right to her ear so that not even the walls could hear. "I know," I whispered, my voice smooth and deadly. "I know who handed you that glass." "Kyla." She froze, her breath hitching in her throat. "And you need to know something else," I continued, lying with the absolute conviction of a sociopath. "Julian is telling everyone that you stole the drink. He is telling the police that you have a drug problem and that you spiked the glass yourself. He is pinning the whole thing on you to save his own skin." I pulled back to look at her. The betrayal in her eyes was total. The fear was gone, replaced by a spark of pure, venomous hate. I squeezed her hand one last time and stood up. I had just lit the fuse on the bomb that would blow Julian's defense to pieces. The seed of paranoia I planted in Kyla's mind metastasized immediately. She was no longer just a victim. She was a witness who knew too much. She began to see Julian not as her lover, but as her attempted murderer. She realized that her survival was a critical flaw in his plan, a loose end he would inevitably try to cut. Her newfound terror was a more potent weapon than any poison. Julian, meanwhile, was riding his own wave of panic. He arrived at the hospital later that afternoon, a bouquet of cheap roses in his hand, a performance of the concerned boss for the nurses. But when he reached Kyla's room, she was ready for him. The nurses informed him that Ms. Vance was refusing all visitors. He pushed past them. Of course, Julian always believed his charm could open any door. He entered her room, and the explosion was immediate. I wasn't there to see it, but the nurses' reports, which I later acquired, described Kyla erupting like a cornered animal. She threw her plastic water cup at him, screaming for him to get out, screaming that he was a murderer, that he had tried to kill her. He fled the hospital, his face white, the roses abandoned in the hallway. He got into his car, his Tesla, his sanctuary of leather and quiet, and slammed the door. And that is when the microphone under his driver's seat, my silent little witness, began to broadcast. He did not drive. He sat in the parking garage and immediately dialed her number. I was in my office, monitoring the live audio feed, and I hit record. "Kyla, listen to me," he yelled into the phone, his voice echoing in the small enclosed space of the car. "You have to calm down. You are hysterical. You are going to ruin everything." Her voice, tinny and raw from the other end, was a shriek. "You did this. You tried to kill me. You poisoned me." "It was a mistake," he roared back. "And this was the moment. The silver bullet. It was an accident. That was not for you. Don't you understand? The dose, the glass. It was all for Blair. You were never supposed to drink it." He kept talking, kept confessing, his panic overriding all common sense. He told her she was ruining their plan, that the money was almost theirs, that he had found a way to access the $10 million from the merger. He begged her to be quiet, to trust him, to let him handle it. He admitted everything. He admitted it to her, and he admitted it to me. I stopped the recording. I had it. The entire case, bound in a 3-minute digital file: motive, intent, conspiracy, and a full confession. It was the foundation, the steel frame, and the concrete of his prison cell. My next move was surgical. I routed the audio file through a series of anonymous servers, stripped the metadata, and sent it to Kyla's personal email from an untraceable address. The subject line read, "What Julian really thinks." I knew she would be in her hospital bed, staring at her phone, stewing in her fear and rage. She would open it. She would listen. She would hear her lover, her co-conspirator, calmly confirming that her life was just collateral damage in a failed attempt to murder his wife. The confirmation came 2 hours later, via a call from a public defender to my lawyer, Silas. Kyla was ready to talk. She was ready to testify against Julian in exchange for a reduced sentence. She would be the state's star witness. Silas, ever the traditionalist, asked me when we should schedule the meeting with the district attorney. He was ready to hand over the file, to let the justice system take its slow, grinding course. "No," I told him, looking out my office window at the skyline I owned. "Not yet. Julian's crimes were not just legal, they were public. He tried to turn my success into his profit. He tried to tear down my name. I wanted him to be exposed, not in a quiet, sterile courtroom, but in the most brilliant, humiliating way possible. I wanted him to fall from the highest peak I could build. The award ceremony was this Saturday. It would be broadcast live, nationally. The police will get their man, Silas," I said. "But first, I am going to get my justice." The Saturday of the Global Visionary Architect Awards arrived with the weight of a coronation. The venue was the Grand Horizon Theater, a century-old opera house restored to a level of opulence that made the air feel thin and expensive. Outside, the red carpet was a gauntlet of flashing cameras and shouting reporters, broadcasting live to a national audience. Inside, the theater was a cavern of gold leaf and velvet, filled to capacity with the titans of industry. I dressed for war. I chose a gown of silk crepe in a shade of red so deep it bordered on crimson, the color of arterial blood. It was a deliberate choice, a visual scream against the sea of black tuxedos and safe, neutral cocktail dresses. I wanted to be the only thing Julian saw. I wanted to burn into his retinas. Julian was at my side, performing the role of the supportive husband with an intensity that bordered on manic. He wore a bespoke tuxedo that cost more than most people's cars, his hair perfectly coiffed, his smile fixed in place like it had been stapled there. But I could feel the tremor in his arm where he held mine. It was the vibration of a man standing on a ledge. He was desperate. The deadline with his creditors was Monday morning. He needed me dead tonight. My private investigators had intercepted a search history on his phone from earlier that day, detailing the anatomy of the carotid artery and the onset time of concentrated insulin shock. In the inner pocket of his jacket, resting against his ribcage, was a small, loaded syringe. This was his plan B. Since the poison had failed, he intended to induce a fatal hypoglycemic shock in the confusion of the backstage area, claiming I had collapsed from exhaustion. He tried to pull me close as we navigated the crowded lobby, his hand seeking the small of my back, inching upward, but he never got the chance. I had surrounded myself with a phalanx of security disguised as high-level donors and junior associates. Every time Julian moved within striking distance, a large man in a suit would seamlessly intervene, shaking his hand, clapping him on the shoulder, or simply stepping into his path to offer congratulations. I kept him exactly 1 meter away at all times, a radius of safety maintained by invisible walls. We reached the heavy velvet curtains of the stage wings. The stage manager, a woman with a headset and a clipboard, signaled 2 minutes to air. The roar of the crowd on the other side of the curtain was a low, hungry rumble. I stopped and turned to Julian. I looked him in the eyes, searching for a trace of the man I had once loved, but I found only a cornered rat waiting to bite. I reached out and adjusted his bow tie, a mirror image of the gesture I had made the night he tried to poison me. "Julian," I said, my voice soft and filled with a terrifying warmth. "You have been my rock through all of this madness with Kyla. I want you to stand right here, just inside the wings. When I finish my speech and walk off that stage, I want you to be the very first thing I see." His eyes lit up. It was the look of a gambler who had just been dealt an ace. He interpreted my request as total submission. He believed I was still the clueless, adoring wife, walking blindly into his trap. He nodded, squeezing my hand. "I will be right here, darling," he promised, "waiting for you." He was thinking about the darkness of the backstage corridor. He was thinking about the syringe in his pocket and how easy it would be to inject me as he embraced me in the shadows, blaming my collapse on the stress of the week. He thought he had won. The announcer's voice boomed through the auditorium speakers, magnified 1,000 times. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the CEO of Ethelgard Structures and this year's global visionary, Blair Monroe." The curtain swept open. I stepped out of the darkness and into the blinding white heat of the spotlight. The applause hit me like a physical wave, a wall of sound that vibrated in my chest. I walked to the center of the stage, my red dress blazing under the lights. Behind me, the massive LED screen flickered to life, displaying the towering silver logo of my company. I stood at the podium, gripping the edges with both hands, and looked out at the sea of faces. I took a breath, savoring the oxygen. Julian was waiting in the wings for a murder. I was standing in the light, ready for an execution. Architecture is, at its core, an act of faith. I began my speech, my voice steady and amplified, filling the cavernous silence of the theater. "We trust that the steel will hold. We trust that the concrete will cure. We trust that the structures we build will protect us from the storms outside." I paused, letting the words settle over the audience like a benediction. I looked down at the front row, where the city's elite sat in rapt attention. They saw a woman at the pinnacle of her career. They had no idea they were witnessing a controlled demolition. "But," I continued, my tone dropping an octave, hardening into something colder, something brittle. "Sometimes, the foundation we trust the most is rotting from the inside. Sometimes, the danger is not the storm outside. It is the person holding the umbrella." That was the signal. I raised my left hand slightly, a gesture imperceptible to the crowd, but a command to my technical director in the booth. The massive LED screen behind me, which was supposed to display a montage of my life's work, flickered. The branding of Ethelgard Structures vanished. In its place, a stark, high-definition video feed appeared. It was not a render. It was raw surveillance footage, enhanced to crystal clarity by the best forensic video specialists money could buy. A collective gasp rippled through the audience, a sound like air being sucked out of the room. On the screen, towering 30 feet high, was Julian. He was standing at the bar from the pre-gala party. The footage was zoomed in, tracking his hands with forensic precision. Every person in the room, and millions watching at home, saw him look over his shoulder. They saw his hand dip into his pocket. They saw the small paper packet. And they saw the white powder cascade into the champagne flute. I did not turn around to look at the screen. I stared straight ahead, watching the horror bloom on the faces of the guests. I saw hands cover mouths. I saw eyes go wide, but the show was not over. The video cut to the bedroom camera. Julian, stripped of his public charm, looking desperate and greedy, photographing the login credentials I had planted. Then, the audio took over. The screen went black, displaying only a sound wave visualization that pulsed with every syllable. Julian's voice, unmistakable and frantic, boomed through the theater's surround sound system. It was an accident. That was not for you. Don't you understand the dose, the glass? It was all for Blair. You were never supposed to drink it. The confession hung in the air, echoing off the gilded ceiling. The silence that followed was terrified and absolute. It was the silence of 1,000 people realizing they were sitting in a room with a monster. I turned slowly toward the stage wings. The spotlight followed me. Julian was standing exactly where I had told him to wait. He was frozen, a statue of ruin. His face was drained of blood, his skin the color of old ash. He was staring up at the giant screen, at the digital ghost of his own voice. He looked at me, and for the first time, he saw the predator he had tried to kill. He broke. He spun around, desperate to flee into the darkness of the backstage corridors, to run from the light I had cast upon him. But he slammed chest first into the wall of muscle I had placed there. 2 of my security guards stepped out of the shadows, blocking his path, their faces impassive. He bounced off them, staggering back into the sliver of light visible to the audience. He was trapped. I turned back to the microphone. I did not shout. I did not cry. I pointed a single manicured finger toward the man cowering in the wings. This is not a tragedy. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, my voice cutting through the shock like a diamond cutter through glass. This is not a misunderstanding. What you have just seen is the blueprint of a murderer. The public unmasking pushed Julian past the point of no return. His meticulously crafted world had just been reduced to digital rubble, broadcast to millions. He went feral. The veneer of the sophisticated husband cracked and fell away, revealing the desperate animal beneath. With a roar of pure, incoherent rage, he lunged from the wings, not running away, but charging directly at me. He was pulling something from his jacket, a flash of silver, a sleek, razor-sharp letter opener he must have grabbed from his desk as a pathetic last resort. He was going to finish the job in front of the entire world. This was the variable I had calculated but could not completely control. The crowd screamed, a true, terrified sound this time, but I did not move. I did not flinch or step back. I had designed skyscrapers to withstand 100-mile-per-hour winds. I would not be toppled by one broken man. I stood my ground, my eyes locked on his, a matador waiting for the bull's final, useless charge. He never reached me. The moment his designer shoe hit the first step of the stage, the wings exploded with motion. 2 men in dark suits, men who were not my security but detectives from the New York Police Department, burst from both sides of the stage. They had been waiting, as per my lawyer's arrangement. They intercepted Julian in a flying tackle, a blur of motion that sent him crashing onto the stairs, his weapon skittering across the stage and coming to rest near my feet. The cameras, broadcasting live, zoomed in on the chaos. Julian, the respected CFO, was pinned to the floor, his face ground into the red carpet of the steps, his tuxedo jacket ripped. One detective had a knee in his back, cuffing his hands behind him, while the other read him his rights in a loud, clear, procedural voice that cut through the hysteria. Julian Croft, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Blair Monroe, conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, and grand larceny. As they hauled him to his feet, a disheveled, sobbing wreck, the lead detective turned to the cameras and the audience. A warrant is being executed for his accomplice, Kyla Vance, at Mount Sinai Hospital at this very moment. Julian was dragged across the stage, past the podium, past me. Our eyes met one last time. He was looking for something. mercy, perhaps, or recognition of what he had lost. But the woman he had loved, or at least married, was gone. I looked down at him not with hatred, but with the cold, distant pity one feels for a failed experiment. He was a badly designed structure, and he had collapsed under his own weight. I let them drag him into the wings. I let the door of the police cruiser slam shut on his future. Then, I turned back to the microphone. I smoothed the front of my blood-red gown, my hands perfectly steady. I leaned in, and the theater fell back into a stunned, absolute silence. My apologies for the interruption, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. Justice, like architecture, requires absolute precision. For a second, there was nothing. Then, one person in the front row began to clap, then another. Within 10 seconds, the entire theater was on its feet, not with polite applause, but with a roaring, thunderous ovation. It was a sound of support, of survival, of a city that respects a structure that refuses to fall. 6 months later, I sat in my new office. It was a corner unit on the 92nd floor of the new Ethelgard Tower, a building I had designed after the trial. My view was not just of the New York skyline. It was the skyline I had helped create. The company was stronger than ever. The scandal had, ironically, made us legendary. We were the firm that cut out the rot and kept building. My new assistant, a competent woman in her 50s, placed a single document and a pen on my glass desk. It was the last page of the divorce decree. Julian had taken a plea deal, confessing to everything in exchange for a reduced sentence. He would be in prison for at least 25 years. Kyla, for her testimony, would be out in 5. I signed my name, the ink black and final. I picked up my mug. It was not champagne, but a simple green tea that I had brewed myself. I looked out at the city, at the endless, beautiful, structural possibilities, and for the first time in a decade, I smiled. It was the smile of a woman who was free, who was safe, and who was utterly and completely invincible. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from. I would love to connect and share our thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Lily Revenge Stories. Like this video and hit the hype button to help this story reach more people.